התנצלות, זה יהיה באנגלית, כי הבטחתי את זה ל-Israel Studies בתור, כלומר זה תחילה של ה-book review הראשון אולי, זה גם תמיד מסוכן לדבר אחרי מני, אבל אין מה לעשות. So let me begin by saying that I'm sick of hearing about the surprise of enjoying a book on taxes, and what to my mind has become a cliche when people say, oh, I never thought such a dry topic could come alive like that, and so on. By now, a cadre of tax scholars with Asaf in the vanguard has made such comments completely passé. And indeed, what could be more exciting than thinking about the practical place where we decide as a polity what we will do together and how we will push people's efforts to participate. All of us who are interested in politics, in citizenship, in the welfare state, in the way citizens and states combine to act, we're all actually fascinated by taxation, that most basic claim of the collective to obligate each and every one, the most basic incidence of sovereignty. So my mandate here is to, first of all, summarize the book, and then after that I'll say three things. One about Asaf in order to make sure that he blushes a little bit, and then two that are only about the book. So in way of summary, this is the story of the development of taxation in Palestine, Israel, beginning with Ottoman taxation, running straight through the British Mandate, and then from the inception of Israeli statehood through the 1980s and a little bit into the 90s. While the organization is for the most part chronological, the story is actually told on multiple levels. On some levels, development seems almost linear, while on others, almost circular. Asaf is a master juggler, keeping many balls in the air at one time, managing to give their motion the appearance of a coherent story. Of necessity, the account I'll give here of the book's various narrative arcs will be partial, but I'll try to put the main lines on display so that the more in-depth discussions to follow will have a sounding board. So here's the reductive version of the story, beginning from 2 lines of prehistory that Asaf includes, and then running through the period that the book claims to cover. So first there's a geographically determined prehistory, which is Ottoman taxation in Palestine, which the British eventually inherit with the onset of the Mandate. Ottoman taxation, again reductively, is more like tribute than modern tax. It can be summed up in a phrase: discretionary communal compulsion by intermediaries. The Ottoman Empire creates general norms about the type and level of taxation, but its most important taxes are collected by tax farmers at a communal level. So it's a village or perhaps a small region that's responsible for the tax. The tax farmer has de facto discretion. Most of the subjects don't know the exact rule that governs, and they negotiate with the tax farmer. The Ottomans aren't terribly interested in what the subjects think about the taxes. That's the tax farmer's problem. People have to pay the tax because the tax farmer says so, and in turn because they're subjects of the Sultan. They don't have to like it. In fact, they're expected not to. It's just part of being a subject, of being subjected to someone else's rule. If the taxpayers are to believe, tax farmers are rapacious. They try to get every last available act out of them. I think that's the Ottoman basic claim, okay? And tax farmers have a similar view of the village headman. They lie about the crop, they hide assets, they live outwardly like paupers just to avoid the collection of taxes. And this is the system the British will inherit and try to modernize. The second line of prehistory relates to Jewish communities in the diaspora from the Middle Ages to early modernity. These communities taxed, but they did so in a way that was very different from the Ottomans. Since they had no state-backed institutional authority, everything was done by community pressure. People were taught that paying the community's taxes was part of one's identity, part of what it meant to be a Jew. Something that one was obliged to do out of a sense of belonging, even though it was clear on some level that one could conceivably shirk one's duty. But duty was internalized. The rhetoric was built on a sense of choice and voluntariness, but barely below the surface lay community pressure of all sorts, including threats of ostracism and punishment beyond this world. When the British take over in Palestine, their basic impulse is to make the tax system more modern, by which they mean essentially more individualized, more direct, meaning they'd like to eliminate tax farming, more formal, that is less discretion for any intermediaries that to remain, and also the possibility of review of decisions. So they abolish the tithe, they replace property taxes with new ones, they even refund taxes when times are hard, but change generates resistance and nothing succeeds overnight. In rural areas, taxes remain collective throughout the 30s. When the British begin considering the grand modernizing step of introducing income tax, they encounter a number of obstacles. On the one hand, income tax assumes a population that routinely accounts for income. That wasn't the case for much of the population in Palestine. Experts from the Colonial Office had unadulterated Orientalist views of the population. Arabs were backward and dishonest, Jews were conniving and resistant politically. In short, the kind of cooperation, both technical and in terms of willingness, that an income tax required would not be forthcoming, or so thought the British experts until the late 1930s. Then at the end of the 30s, conditions changed. So income tax was successfully introduced in Egypt in 1938, the Arab Revolt, and eventually the war reduced existing tax revenues to a minimum. Jewish support grew because of the sense of support for the British position in the war. The Jewish community had already begun a voluntary income tax, which was another factor in smoothing the introduction of mandate income tax, on which more in a moment. Jewish professionals were also arriving from Europe, filling the gap regarding technical capabilities for an income tax. And in the early 30s, Jews resisted the introduction of an income tax because they felt it would be applied to urban dwellers, and that the Arab population, which was predominantly rural, would escape paying. Palestinians supported the tax, perhaps for the same reason, or perhaps just because the Jews opposed it. Once the Jews felt themselves to be on the same side as the British in the war, their resistance to the income tax dissipated. British income tax still had much informality to it, especially in granting relief from taxes, even though there was no official procedure for granting such relief. But the rising importance of lawyers and accountants brought with it additional pressure to formalize arrangements as much as possible, including by using British precedent in the review of tax assessments. Meanwhile, during the 1940s, the Jews of Palestine were busy developing their own paradoxical, voluntary compulsory tax. The idea was that community pressure would make tax compulsory, even as a sense of belonging to the community would characterize the tax as voluntary, which in essence it was, because no institution could actually enforce it. But means of coercion in the sense of effective community pressure did exist and were thoroughly exploited by the state in the making. Propaganda and education mixed promiscuously, targeting everyone from children to mothers to religious communities to individual taxpayers. The state in the making was providing some social services and generated a fair amount of willingness to pay for those services by contributing to an array of taxing mechanisms, some of them geared towards specific projects, and others for general expenses. The Palestinian population was also engaged in fundraising, but never really recovered from the internal splintering of the community generated by the Arab Revolt. There was some attempt to formalize the voluntary tax system, especially by German Jews who tellingly shared some of the same Orientalist attitudes that characterized the British tax administrators. They made some strides, though partial and short-lived. There was also resistance within the Jewish community, particularly by revisionists who resorted to violence. Surprise. But this did not undermine the success of the voluntary tax system overall. There are two more stages in the chronological development, which I'll breeze through fairly quickly. With the establishment of the state, the voluntary compulsory taxes were abolished, but their overall ethos remained in place. The early state took over a system of tax from the mandate, took over income tax from the mandate, but advanced an ethic of tax compliance that was a direct extension of the voluntary tax system that applied to Jews. Ideological statism was supposed to produce regimented voluntarism or statist pioneering, and the state was there to support it with propaganda, education, inspirational speeches, and even a scary/entertaining proto-apocalyptic film about the decay that would follow if people didn't pay their taxes. This is actually one of the most entertaining parts of the book, especially there's a scene of children in a schoolyard doing terrible things, and initially it had kids drinking vodka, but that was considered too shocking, and so they replaced that with kids drinking wine. When new waves of Jewish immigration from Arab countries flowed in, Israeli tax officials spouted the same Orientalist rhetoric that the British had used before them, but this time they were intent on massive re-education. High tax rates were followed by internal rifts, with salaried workers complaining that the self-employed didn't report actual income and thus were not paying their fair share. Tax burden was a hot political issue. Tax compliance was a national project. The leadership, at least, saw tax voluntarism as an issue for community pressure and education. Minor attempts at using law, especially criminal law, were fairly quickly abandoned. Resistance was met with negotiation, and the underlying ethos was one of training for citizenship. In all of this, the state was trying to work directly on the individual, but not in an individualistic sense. The reason to pay taxes was communal. The obligation itself was part of a direct relationship between the state and the individual. Indeed, it was the manifestation of the individuals being part of the community. The final two chapters of the book detail a breakdown of this direct, soft appeal and the rise of a new type of intermediary, the tax professional. Lawyers, accountants, and economists. So it's the tax professional, but it's actually three different groups of people. And in part, this is a supply-side story. More accountants who from their 1950s are a regulated profession, more lawyers about whom everyone here knows too much, and economists who were no longer working exclusively on Israeli development issues, but now were committed to general models. Each of these actors contributed to a vision of taxation that eroded the projected harmony between the state and the community. Now, instead, these actors could speak for an individual whose interest was free economic activity, and thus the limitation of state intrusion to a minimum, and a minimum that would be predictable in advance. Accountants morphed from servants of the state to servants of their clients, lawyers from officers of the court to aggressive representatives of their clients' interests, economists from particularist, apologetic Zionists to universal scientists of market behavior. The state's direct relationship with its taxed population in essence broke down. The relationship had a new go-between, the professional intermediaries who relied on taxation being law-like, formalized, and scientific. Taxation was adversarial again, not quite in the sense it had been under the Ottomans, where the relationship was actually hostile, but still adversarial. In the late 1970s and 80s, developments were geared toward additional formalization and streamlining, crystallizing the new system. Formal, mediated by experts, and calculable. This is a fascinating story of how we arrived where we are, or at least where we were sometime in the mid-90s, I guess. And Asaf is right to conclude that it tells us a great deal about three things. One is the richness of the connection between citizenship and taxation, which I really believe you can't understand one without the other. The second is the relative novelty of formal law agents, the accountants and lawyers in taxation history. It is that they're very latecomers, and they're playing on a field that's been cleared by others. And three, the importance of the social norm background for understanding the development of law. This is actually a big point, and I won't expand on it here, except to say this. We're habituated to understand social interaction as taking place in the shadow of the law. At least the lawyers among us. But Asaf teaches us that sometimes things work precisely the other way around. Law develops in the shadow of normative systems the communities generate without resort to them. Okay, so that's by way of summary. Now three fast points about the book, or about reading this book. So first, I want to salute Asaf for his discipline. Anyone who's spent a significant amount of time with Asaf has probably had the exhilarating experience of a conversation in which Asaf recalls some gem that he found in the archive. When that happens, Asaf is transformed. The part of his heart that contains pure joy conquers the rest of his body. His eyes sparkle, his lips crinkle into the smile of someone enjoying a guilty pleasure. And if he's wearing sandals, you might see his toes twitch. It's an ecstasy. Anyone who encounters this knows that Asaf could never have been anything but an historian, or else he would have been eternally miserable. He's a man who's found his calling. But for someone with this kind of personality to spend years in the archives, the dust is what he really is after. To spend years in the archives, to find dozens, if not hundreds, of barely related gems, and then to put most of them aside, or to harness them, almost by violence, for the good of a complex but eminently understandable narrative, well, it's the mark of incredible willpower. I hope that putting aside some of those gems was not too painful. The result is certainly a gem for the reader. So, the second thing, I'd love to hear a bit of speculation from Asaf regarding the axes of divisions over tax policy. In the early parts of the story, the axis of conflict over tax is clearly national. Palestinians and Jews want different styles of taxes because they see themselves differently placed in terms of where those taxes will fall. It's a straight story about tax incidence. It's true that there's an overlap with the urban-rural divide to some extent, but the energy is completely national. Later on, in the book, there's another clear divide, which is a class divide. Salaried workers think that the self-employed aren't paying their share, and there's a lot of talk that concentrated interests, whether they're corporate interests or others who have links to politically connected groups, get special treatment. And then, perhaps as part of the movement of neoliberalism in this story, it seems like the divides are washed out of the story. And I wonder whether today major political discussions about getting new communities into the workforce are in fact a new way of talking about where the tax burden lies. And perhaps those discussions are just waiting to be turned into a conflict over tax policy. Finally, third and more speculative still, in 1963, Nicholas Kaldor, it's that Nicholas Kaldor from Kaldor-Hicks Efficiency, everyone knows, published an article entitled, "Will Underdeveloped Countries Learn to Tax?" So, I'll say something about this article in 1 second, but when I mentioned this article to Asaf, he immediately ran into his room and found a picture from the archive of Nicholas Kaldor when he was visiting Israel, and it's a picture on a cigarette box and talking about tobacco taxes, and it was just a fabulous moment. I knew that I had to use this. So, the message of this article was that strong states need to tax much more heavily than weak or failing states generally do. He actually hints that they have to double their taxation in terms of GDP compared to what they're doing at the time of writing. And just as important, he claims that for the tax system to work, it must be progressive. Because if the taxes fall too heavily on weaker segments of the population, the wealthy will spend on luxuries rather than investing on capital development. Now, by Kaldor's lights, Israel in the 1960s had probably already learned to tax. It wasn't quite underdeveloped. It had succeeded in generating enough infrastructure, social, cultural, and economic, to become a developed country. But perhaps for the last 10 or 15 years, we're actually on the opposite track. We're lowering the tax intake. So Israel is significantly below the OECD average and also below where it was 10 years ago. And we've been making it less progressive. We rely more on taxes that are typically thought to be regressive, much more on value-added tax and payroll tax than most OECD countries do today, and much more than we did, well, say in the 70s. Now, we're not alone in this movement. But perhaps what is going on is that developed countries, and Israel among them, are taking the taxation road to underdevelopment. If that's the case, we might wonder what its impact would be on the categories like citizenship and community that Asaf develops in this history.